Hi there. So in this video, we're going to go over the 5 different types of trauma. My name is Christopher, and I'll be guiding us through this presentation today. So let's jump right into it. So as we begin our discussion around trauma, I think it's very important that we understand what it is that we're actually talking about. Trauma is a buzzword that is being thrown around in a lot of therapeutic and healing circles. And trauma is something that I hear constantly thrown out by coaches and therapists. And I think that it's really important that we understand what this word means as we go about talking about it. So, what is trauma? If you even ask yourself what trauma is, what kind of comes to mind for you? What are some of the images around trauma, or just the ideas that you have around it? I think that's really important to ask ourselves to understand what we see trauma as in the world. And to me, what trauma is sort of inside of each and every one of us. I feel that we're asking this fundamental question of, am I safe in the world? So, emotional and psychological trauma is the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter your sense of security. So, what trauma does is it sort of overlays this idea of this question, asking this question, am I safe in the world, with the idea that I am not safe. Something happened to me, and the world is not a safe place in this context. And so trauma becomes a way that we answer this question of, am I safe in the world? And this question is very subjective and unique to each individual. Someone with trauma, for instance, a survivor of wartime, a wartime refugee, a survivor of incest, a survivor of deep psychological terrors, is going to have a different experience of safety in the world than somebody who maybe grew up with a little more privilege in a more safe society. Um, Trauma, according to the APA, is a pervasive problem. So it results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental health, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. So trauma is a pervasive problem. Trauma is something that happens to us that uh, doesn't necessarily leave the body, and that's what Van der Kolk talks about in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He basically talks about how our body is constantly storing and processing information from the external world around us to give us a sense of the world. We orient ourselves based off the information that we receive from an external level about the world, asking questions, for instance, like, am I safe? Is it okay to be me? And when we ask these questions and we're hit with something that is pervasive, then those questions are, no, I'm not safe, and no, it's not okay to be who I really am. And that's what trauma does, is it goes into our body and it creates these belief systems as a way to try and protect us from hurting ourselves again in the future. So it served a purpose at one point with the protection mechanisms, but then over time it becomes important to unwind these protection mechanisms because they may not serve us at an adult level. They may have served us when we were 7 years old and unable to protect ourselves or intellectually understand what was occurring inside of us, but to an adult, those same protection mechanisms may not necessarily help us. When we experience a trauma during our childhood development, we become stunted at that stage of childhood development. There's several different things that may happen to us. We may either regress, we may either progress into a next stage of development, but essentially we become frozen at that psychological stage of development inside of us at some point, and we try to compensate that in several different ways through different defense mechanisms. And that's going to be different and unique to each individual based off of their ancestral heritage, based off of their external environment, based off the specific trauma that's happened to them. Our brain has different ways of processing and protecting ourselves from trauma as well. And so, also, trauma is an unprocessed emotion or information, aka it's basically energy, and that's what emotion is it's energy in motion. And when it gets stuck and trapped inside of the body, it can start becoming a poison that starts seeping into our life. And so, our objective is to clear that energy and to allow the trauma to move freely through our body. So trauma occurs when events happen too quickly, too painfully, too violently, too coercively, and just anything that happens too fast, or anything that is too much for our body or brain to process. That's essentially what trauma is to me and what we'll be talking about in today's container. And I also want to leave you with this quote as well from Van der Kolk's book. It takes enormous trust and courage to allow yourself to remember. So couple of things around being human and having trauma. So being human means that we have trauma. Trauma is synonymous with being human. That's just a part of living as a human being. So we all have trauma. Trauma is synonymous with being human. Nobody leaves childhood without some form of trauma. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And here's a couple of common protection mechanisms that our brain falls into in terms of denial around trauma. It's maybe easy to say, well, yeah, of course, they have trauma, but I grew up, I came from a good family, and this is actually a defense mechanism that I've used in my life. Is of course I don't have trauma. I came from a good family. I don't, it's obvious to see that infants over in Syria who are in war right now, they've got trauma, but I don't think that I have trauma right now. Um, I want to talk about this idea of coming from quote unquote a good family. So this is a common defense mechanism. We all come from dysfunctional families. Coming from a quote unquote good family does not mean that you do not have trauma. Unresolved trauma passes down from generation to generation. We have generational trauma. It is stored within the DNA of our body. If something happens to our great great grandmother and it is not processed in the next generation, it continues down the lineage until eventually that energy is processed at some point. So, for instance, in my family tree, I have trauma that comes from, for instance, my great great grandfather killed himself. And so there's a ancestral wounding that has occurred, and there's information that's being processed through the children of my great great grandfather and just everything that happens within the processing of suicide within the family. And so that suicide gets dispersed and the pain is carried through the other family members in the trauma. And we all have that. We all have family members at some point who may have done something very traumatic to the family tree, and so we all carry that ancestral trauma. So coming from quote unquote a good family is a defense mechanism. It's a form of denial that we use to keep ourselves from feeling or remembering or acknowledging what's really going on inside of our bodies. Another common defense mechanism is that other people have more severe trauma than me. So this is something that is brought up a lot in healing circles as well. Is, well, yeah, I acknowledge that I have trauma, but other people have it way worse than I do. So this is another common defense mechanism, and something to remember when it comes to trauma is that trauma is a subjective experience to each individual. Something that is traumatizing to one individual may not be traumatizing to another individual. Our pain thresholds, our emotional threshold for how much emotion we can tolerate, that's all completely subjective on so many different factors inside of an individual. And it's important that we acknowledge that what may be traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to something that is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. So that's really important to keep in mind as we move forward, so that the defense mechanism that other people have more trauma than me isn't something that we want to use. And if we have those thoughts coming up inside of ourselves, it's an opportunity to maybe look at that within ourselves. So many people may feel guilt about acknowledging their own trauma, knowing other people may have it worse. Trauma is subjective to each individual. So just acknowledging that we may carry guilt that, well, I can't heal or process or look at my own trauma because other people have it way worse than I do. That, like this moral idea of it not being fair, that other people have it worse than I do, means that there's somehow some guilt that I'm carrying inside of who I am or the privilege that I have, or that could also be something that comes up as well. And if we have more severe forms of trauma, it's actually in the psychological space way easier to work with trauma that people know about that's more extreme than it is for some of that more subtle and coercive trauma that can occur. I also want to talk about this idea of big T trauma versus little t trauma. So trauma can come instantly in the form of like crazy shocking events of big T traumas, of wartime events, sexual abuse, extreme intensity in a specific moment. And it can also come over time in forms of little t traumas, of just overall acknowledgement of who I am in the world based off of how my caretakers treat me, and the subtle course of family unit that can create trauma about who we are. And ultimately, what a lot of this is saying is it's denying authenticity of who we are at our core. I also want to acknowledge that I've learned a lot of this information from my mentor, Dr. Bob Beare, and so I wanted to acknowledge his work. He has an awesome book that I will link down below called "Stop Doing Shit You Don't Want to Do," and a lot of this is information that I pulled from him and his work. So I want to acknowledge him and thank him for everything that he's taught and continues to teach me. So, a couple things to understand also before we dive into the 5 different types of trauma are that children internalize everything. So a child's worldview is that children see what is happening in the external world as a result of who they are. So this means that if dad hits me, if mom screams at me, they can't be the problem. I must be the problem and deserving of it. So if something happens in the external world that is traumatic to me, I must be the problem. I internalize that whatever's happening in the world is because of me. If something happens to someone else, if mom gets into a divorce, if dad is fired from work, I somehow internalize that as I've done something wrong. And so I start carrying the pain of what happened to my caretakers or parents. So to acknowledge that we internalize everything as children, we don't have a choice of that. That's just how we see the world in a very infantile sort of way. Children do not intellectually process at the same level as adults. So what that means is that if mom is coming home drunk late at night and screaming at dad, we're not sitting there as children saying, wow, mom could really go to therapy or a 12-step group. Children do not have the ability or space to process in a mature fashion. And then trauma attacks the authenticity of the child, saying, who I am is not okay. So just to break that down, recognizing that as children, we can't intellectually compartmentalize or understand what is happening to us because of somebody else's trauma. We don't understand that we're being treated like crap because mom hasn't dealt with her unresolved trauma yet. We take that on once again and we internalize that trauma. And that's how the intergenerational trauma is passed on. We're not here to blame anybody. Nobody's doing this at a conscious level. It's a very unconscious process that is occurring. So we're not here to blame anyone. And it may happen consciously. Sometimes there are perpetrators, but to acknowledge that hurt people. And a lot of this stems from pain inside of the body. And then once again, trauma attacks the authenticity of who we are at our core. So basically what happens to us is that the trauma says that who I am inside of myself, who I am at the core of my being is not okay. It's not okay to be me. And this is something that we all do, is we change who we are to appease our parents or teachers or friends, or something happens to us that basically acknowledges that who I am is not okay. And that's okay that we did that. And it's important that at some point we forgive ourselves for that, because we did the right thing, because we did it in order to survive. And then lastly, part of the healing process is learning to see through adults' eyes. So part of healing from trauma is seeing the child's world through the eyes of the adult, letting the inner child know that now I am safe, I am lovable, I am okay, etc. And so trauma basically runs the show through our life, and because of that, we have the opportunity to now go back and tell ourselves in this moment, look around, I'm safe, I'm not being attacked, nothing's happening right now. And that's what trauma does, is it sort of is always on this high alert state that something bad could be happening. And so now through adults' eyes, we can go back and just acknowledge that what is happening is okay inside of the human body. So now let's move on. This is one of the best structures that I've seen in regards to understanding trauma. So this is called the trauma tree, and this is an exercise I do with a lot of the clients who I work with to help understand what is happening inside of their bodies and where trauma comes from. So as we talk about trauma, I always like to open it up with a conversation by asking, okay, what is the most common form of trauma that most people think of when they think of trauma? And the number one answer that comes to mind is abuse. So what is abuse? Abuse is something that typically happens within a power dynamic. There's typically something that occurs where there's a perpetrating energy or an attack onto an individual. Abuse can come in many different forms: physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual. There's so many different types of abuse, and abuse basically happens when there's a perpetrating energy or force that is going into another individual and is wounding that person in some way. And it typically is one of those forms of trauma that happens extremely quickly. It's also a form of trauma that's really easy to point at. For instance, a child getting hit as a child, a common defense mechanism to that as well. I deserved it. I look at me now. I definitely earned it. No child deserves or earns to be hit. Hitting children does not actually help the child at all. It completely stunts the growth of the child. And then the child takes on, once again, that defense mechanism, that denial, defending the parents. Well, I deserved it. I earned it. or I would be a way different person now if I wasn't hit as a child. So acknowledging that hitting children is a form of abuse, and holding that and acknowledging that that is very real. When we are hit or sexually abused or something happens, we take on the energy of the perpetrator, and we typically become the perpetrator in some way. So that's why it's very common for children, if they get hit from one of their caretakers and they go to school and now they're hitting people, and then all of a sudden the teachers and the parents are getting mad at them for hitting them. It's like, well, they're internalizing the abuser. That's what we do. Is typically there's a power struggle that happens, and we identify with the abuser in order to feel a secure sense of safety within the world. Another very common form of trauma is neglect. So neglect occurs when we do not get our needs met. Neglect is all about needs, and we have many needs. We have emotional needs, we have physical needs, we have safety needs, shelter needs, clothing needs. Excuse me. So neglect occurs when we as children don't get our needs met in a healthy way. Because of the large brain size of a child, in terms of how children are birthed, we are birthed at a very premature state. Most animals, deer, horses, are instantly able to come out of the womb and start walking and start nursing and start participating in the world. Whereas us as children and as humans, we don't have that ability. And it takes a long time for our brains to develop because of how big it is and how wide birthing hips can be in terms of evolutionary process. And so because of that, we don't have the ability to meet our own basic needs. And so we may feel neglect. And that means as children, we may have experienced neglect, for instance, in severe forms of malnourishment, of mom and dad not being able to bring food for us, of mom and dad getting high and not being there emotionally for us, of mom and dad working all the time. And even though they may have worked or done something for our needs, we don't understand it in that way because mom and dad aren't around. So there's a misperception to truth and reality that basically tells us that in some way we are unworthy of love. And that's what all of this is about, is that in some way I'm unworthy of love. I am unlovable in some way. Each one of these forms of trauma acknowledges that in some capacity. And so that means also that with the healing of it is bringing that love back, bringing that sense of compassion and in loving ourselves and learning how to do that. So neglect is really important to understand too in terms of an infant level, because to an infant, this can happen if they do not get their needs met instantly. When a baby is crying out and screeching for food, or maybe they've accidentally soiled themselves and their diaper is just not very comfortable, and they're sitting there and they're hungry and they're crying, and mom and dad aren't coming because mom and dad are focusing on the other children or something's going on, and that child doesn't get that need met in 20 minutes. So that child doesn't know, that baby in that infant does not know that it is going to die in the next 20 minutes. And because of that, the child is basically lost in a state of complete trauma, in terms of that child thinks that it's going to die because it hasn't tested reality enough yet to understand that it is going to live through this experience. Until it has enough experiences where it can understand that, oh, mom and dad can be gone for 20 minutes and things are going to be okay, then that child will start to carry a wound inside of itself. And especially if those needs aren't being met in a healthy way. And so that child, that neglect can be so subtle and so subversive. And for instance, if a child is crying out for attention and is looking its mother in the eyes, and that mother turns her gaze away, to the child, that could be a traumatic moment. That's that little t trauma that we're talking about. But to that child, to that subjective experience, that was too much emotional pain, too much fear for the child to be able to handle. And because of that, the child internalizes and stores that energy in the body and is not able to process it. So this can happen at a very subtle level. Another form of trauma is abandonment. Abandonment is pretty self-explanatory. Abandonment basically occurs when there is a leaving in some way. So that could be a physical leaving, to have a father leave or a mother leave or both parents leave. There could be an actual abandonment. If you're an adopted child, then there probably most likely is an abandonment wound in there. Many of us may experience abandonment wounds in other ways as well. So if we experience an emotionally absent parent, that could be a neglect wound, but it can also have an abandonment wound. And we can be emotionally abandoned as well. If mom and dad are physically there, but they're emotionally checked out or they're not present with us, that's also a form of abandonment that we may experience as well. And so these forms of trauma can actually kind of mesh together and sort of have different forms of these traumas within just our nervous systems and our psyches. So another common form of trauma is critical incidents. So critical incidents include war, they include concussions, they include car wrecks, they include divorce, they include certain external events that happen in our lives that create trauma: earthquakes, fires, natural disasters, like I mentioned, war, terrorist attacks, just something that happens in the external world that causes an extreme amount of fear. Once again, we internalize that. A lot of us growing up, we all may have experienced fear or terror when the Twin Towers were bombed. That was a huge critical incident. Or maybe some of us have lived through a fire growing up at our home, or some severe earthquakes or tsunamis. These are all forms of critical incidents that occur in our lives that result in that nature. And same with concussions or actual trauma to the body, physical trauma to the body. Car wrecks are huge, and sporting accidents. These are all forms of trauma that occurs within the body. Now, before we dive into this last one, I want to talk about this last one here because a lot of these are fairly understood and known. But the last form of trauma is something that happens at a very subtle level within the body. It's very subversive, but it's also the most common form of trauma inside of the body. This happens within the family system, within the family unit, and it happens within every single family. And I want to talk about this because it's so difficult to understand and to see this form of trauma. So this form of trauma is known as enmeshment. And an enmeshment wound occurs basically when a child is forced to grow up too quickly, that when a child is forced to take on the emotional needs of the parent in some way. Now, in a healthy family, the child is the center of the family, meaning the family is child-centric. This means that the child's needs are the sole focus of being met, that the child's needs, emotional, physical, and otherwise, are what the parent seeks to meet in a healthy way. Eventually, that child learns a sense of independence and how to meet those needs on their own. However, what happens in a lot of families, in every family, is that the child at some point starts taking on the emotional needs of the parents. The child starts taking on the enmeshment of the family in some way, trying to fix the family, trying to solve the family. A very good question you can ask yourself to see if you have an enmeshment wound is it easier for me to give love to other people than it is to give love to myself? Do I have difficulty giving love to myself, but I find it easy to give love to other people? This is the enmeshment wound. This is what happens to us, is that we find it very easy to start appeasing to mom and dad and to siblings around us before meeting our own needs. And so that's where that enmeshment wound stems from. That enmeshment wound can also come in forms of growing up too quickly, having to take care of our parents, having our parents tell us maybe some sexually explicative information about the other parent or about themselves, and stuff that we really shouldn't be knowing about their sexual history or their life as a young child. Mom and dad may be giving us information that we're not able to talk about. Mom and dad may be coming to us in a subversive way. This happens a lot in divorced families, but it happens in other families as well, where mom will start telling things to the child about dad, and dad will start telling things to the child to try to win them over mom. And sort of this subversive and coercive culture begins, where the child then becomes sort of like the mitigator and this stabilizer in the triangle between the mom and the dad. And this happens across all families. And this is something that it's important for us to just be aware of and to work through and to heal, so that we can start ending these generational cycles of enmeshment wounds. And that's also the most subtle and most extreme form of enmeshment. And this is basically the form of enmeshment that keeps us trapped as humans when we're trying to do things like create or build businesses or go out and enjoy life, or even being able to just enjoy who we are and meet our own needs before meeting other people. So all of these forms of trauma create within us a single emotion. And that emotion, you can maybe guess, is shame. Every single traumatic event creates the emotion of shame. So each one of these traumas is the roots of our tree, and shame is the trunk of the tree. Shame is the emotion that says, in some way, I am unworthy of love. Shame is the acknowledgement that I'm bad or I'm wrong, or that something about who I really am isn't okay. So all of these forms of trauma create shame. And so what that means is that when we look at the external results in our life of trauma, we can start seeing maybe not the trauma itself, but we can see the fruits of the trauma. So these are the fruits of the trauma: perfectionism, divorce, addiction, depression, violence, codependency, suicide, self-harm, anxiety, stealing, self-sabotage, repeating generational cycles, toxic relationships, social anxiety, feeling stuck in life, eating disorders, crime, fear. So all of these are fruits of shame. So if you have experienced any of these in your life, and there's obviously way more that can happen as well, then you have some form of trauma in your life. All of these fruits stem from the shame inside of us, which stem from the trauma. When we have a traumatic event that happens to us, we tell ourselves a lie about who we are and who the world is around us. So let's say mama hits me, and instead of saying that's not okay, a mom should not hit a child, I say, oh, I'm bad. And then I internalize that and I live my life from that paradigm. And that happens at a deep unconscious level. And I build belief systems on top of that. And then I enact myself out that I'm bad. So I start doing bad things. I start maybe doing crime, or maybe I get into addiction, start doing hard drugs, trying to cope with those extremely intense feelings inside of myself. Maybe I go as far as even having suicidal thoughts and ideation. Maybe I develop and go the other way and develop an extremely strict form of perfectionism and don't allow myself to make any mistakes out of fear of being hurt or traumatized again. So recognizing that those forms of trauma create shame, which then create the fruits of our trauma. So we can see the fruits of the trauma right here. So as we go back to our trauma tree, it's important to understand that as we start unraveling this, a way into healing is to see an event that's happened to us, talk about it, feel the shame that's occurring within us, and then remembering what happened to us as children. And I want to talk about this little aspect here, because what all of these have done, all of these forms of trauma have done, is wounded our authentic core in some way. And so what that means is that shame is actually a highway into our authentic core and who we really are. Shame, paradoxically, points the way to who we are, because who we are was what got hurt. So that means if we want to find out who we really are, that means going into our shame, feeling what has happened to us, and finding who we really are at the depth of that shame. And so it's being able to tolerate difficult emotions and learning how to do that in a safe and loving way, and going back to that authentic core and reconnecting and learning to love and having dialogue with that authentic core and finding out who we really are and what we enjoy doing and how we enjoy spending our time. Many of us have maybe lived lives of doing things for others in terms of pleasing parents about career decisions, or pleasing friends, or trying to impress people by perhaps making a lot of money. And there's nothing wrong with making money, but depending on the place that it's coming from, there could absolutely be some very coercive forms of money making, and also just trying to prove ourselves to other people and ultimately to ourselves as well. So remembering that what got hurt was our authentic core. So our wounds are actually blessings in the fact that they show us the way to who we really are. So what can we do about this? So a couple of things. Like I just mentioned, it's important that we start working in a way where we can start working our way back to what really happened to us. And a lot of trauma is, it perpetuates due to self-hatred. So something that we must cultivate and learn is compassion towards ourselves. That means also feeling emotions inside of our body. And then that means expressing who we are. That is the form of healing, is loving ourselves and then allowing ourselves to express what was unexpressible at one point in our life. Like I mentioned, trauma is saying that who we are is not okay. And so the healing is allowing ourselves to express who we really are. And so when we work with trauma, a great way to work with trauma is to work with a therapist or a coach like myself, who's trauma informed and who can help you work through the trauma. You can find a group doing therapy work as well. If you'd like to join a therapy group, you can also reach out to me by clicking the link down below. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one as well, you can schedule a call. And if you'd like to join a group as well, go ahead and schedule a free consultation and we'll talk about what would work best for you. And then also, I really recommend working with breath work and psychodrama. So breath work is an amazing form and a way of releasing trauma. You could perhaps search in your local area if there are any breathwork ceremonies coming up. There's a bunch of local breathworks online that you could find, and there's online breathwork as well that you could maybe participate in too. And then also psychodrama or carpet work is a really awesome way to start unwinding what happened to us and allowing ourselves to express in healthy ways. And if you're looking for either of those, once again, feel free to schedule a call with me and I can connect you with certain groups as well. So other than that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, I put a lot of time and effort into these videos, really just for value for you and for your own healing and for the healing of the collective. And if you would help to perpetuate this video in YouTube's algorithm by liking and subscribing, that would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.